Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone who are joining our webinar today, where we're going to be covering the results of our AI innovation report that just was released on Monday. Also thrilled to be joined by Jeremy Palmer, Senior Partner at QuantumBlack AI by McKinsey, and Angelique Augereau, who is the former Chief Analytics Officer at CapitalOne, as well as Tim Gordon, CEO of Best Practice AI, who's held the pen on parts of the report, plus my colleague Jamie, who is going to be our chat host today. There's a lot to get through, a lot of data that we are very excited to present to you from the innovation report. If you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat and we'll either bring them in or seek to answer them in the chat as we go. Just to put a little context around this, this is our second deep dive report since we released the index back in January. The first one, was our talent pillar report that we released and held a webinar on last month. The innovation report is one of the 4 pillars in the index and the second highest weighted, carrying a weight of 30%, and covers aspects such as research, patents, ventures and partnerships, strategic investments, and participation in the open source ecosystem. But also just to remind everyone that we use an outside-in approach for the index, drawing on data from public sources. We mine millions of data points for this index that fall into a total of 142 indicators that fall into these 4 pillars: talent, innovation, leadership, and responsible AI or transparency. But today we're going to dive into the innovation pillar. So if we go to the next slide, just to explain sort of what our coverage is. So we have looked for at this report at 60 banks in total, predominantly in North America and Europe, but we've also added a handful of payment platforms and a few banks in other regions, such as the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and also DBS in Singapore for analytical purposes. We go to the next slide. What we're looking at here, and of course, in the last couple of years, things have changed a lot. We have gone from, will AI have an impact on outcomes and drive value, to AI will absolutely have impact, no doubt, and has therefore become a C-suite priority. So in this report, we are really looking at how banks are setting themselves up to learn and innovate and to be on the front foot of innovation as AI innovation accelerates. And so we've distilled down some of the levers that banks are using and that we've uncovered in the report, such as in-house research. We look at patents, we look at ecosystem partnerships, open source ecosystems, we look at strategic investments in AI companies, and we look at cross-business idea generation. And there's no doubt that what you need is a vision, so you know where you're going. You also need to have somewhere internally a learning machine or a center of excellence or something similar in that vein, and also to have and create an environment where everyone is really thinking about the opportunities across the business lines of the bank. But there are many, many different ways of pursuing this innovation structure and strategy. And there are many pathways to success, and this is what we're really going to be talking about today, both in terms of what is measurable, so what's coming through and what we can see from our metrics and what we've put together, but also aspects that are maybe perhaps less measurable, and therefore great that we've got Jeremy and Angelique and Tim to comment as we go through the results of the report. But with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Annabelle Ailes, my co-founder, who's going to take you through some of the results of the report.
Great. We go to the next slide. So just to quickly dwell on this one before we dive into each of the sections. So I think one of the key findings was that, across all of these different sort of AI innovation levers, the North American banks tend to be dominating. So you can see sort of consistently similar names appearing, like JP Morgan, CapitalOne, RBC, TD, Wells Fargo, etc. So yeah, just a sort of the high level finding was that the North American banks are really doubling down. But Jed, if you go to the next slide, the first section that we're going to talk about is research. And if you go to the next slide again, we're sort of, what do we mean by research? I guess two types of research, generally speaking, the applied research that goes directly into kind of the outcomes and the use cases in the banks today. Pure research tends to be more theoretical, blue sky, and thinking about the problems of tomorrow. Although I do think many banks that are focusing on the kind of pure research do expect that there will be some sort of implementation of those research in the bank at some point in the future. I should say, as Alexandra mentioned, this is very much an outside-in assessment. So this is looking at what papers have been published publicly. A lot of the applied research maybe isn't published. A lot of the more sort of pure theoretical research potentially is. But what we're seeing across the board is a sort of doubling down in terms of publication of research, 70% compound annual growth since 2017. And the US banks tend to be dominating, and the Canadian players too. If we go on to the next slide, we can look at who's leading the way. So this is just looking at research papers published by bank by year. And you can really see JP Morgan's doubling down in this space. So they invested back in, I think, sort of in the mid 2010s, late 2010s, in building an applied and a pure AI research teams. And since then, they've been just doubling down in terms of the publications. But you've also got players like RBC and TD. RBC established Borealis, I think, back in 2016. TD acquired Layer 6 back in 2018. Those two banks have really been investing in their applied and pure research capability. But you've also got payment company Visa. I'm doing a lot in this space. CapitalOne as well with their machine learning research unit. So yeah, I think there are a lot of North American banks that are doubling down across the board. Although we do see, I would say we also do see activity in Europe. European banks, I think there's been a 40% increase in research published by European banks from 2021 to 2022. Intesa Sanpaolo has a particularly interesting sort of group of researchers that are publishing work in this space too. So if we go to the next slide, just to rattle through the data. So who are the researchers? The AI researchers tend to be highly educated, significant proportion of PhDs. At Visa, sort of 80%, over 80% of the researchers that publish this research have PhDs. But the definitions of this talent really varies widely. And we find, you know, around, I think, over 650 people working or publishing AI research in some way. But only some of these, I think about 25% have an AI researcher role title. There are lots of people, you know, within the AI development team, so people who are data scientists or machine learning scientists, machine learning engineers that are publishing research, but there are also a whole lot of people from, you know, other teams, quant teams, all over the bank that are actively publishing research too. So it's not that the only strategy is to have a centralized research function. There's also an approach banks are taking to encourage publications from researchers and individuals across the bank. Next slide, please. This is just looking at where researchers are based. So obviously, I think by nature of the fact that the US banks are publishing so much, we can see a lot of the researchers are based in the States, but it's interesting to see India emerging as a bit of a hub for research talent. And this builds off some of the findings from our talent report that we published back in June, where I think 3 out of the top 10 cities for AI talent were based in India. And I think that, you know, traditionally a lot of banks have thought about India as potentially a place for offshoring of some of the kind of lower level AI or engineering or data roles. I think this just goes to show that actually there's a lot of academic excellence in the country, a lot of AI capability in the country, and in fact, more publishing from India than Canada or the UK. And we saw, I think Citi announced a couple of weeks ago, they're hiring 5,000 AI and engineering related roles in India precisely for this reason. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. Final slide on research. Next slide, Jenny, is just sort of why. And I think we should dwell on this slide a bit, but I think there are 3 questions that we typically hear. So one is, why focus on AI research at all? And I think, you know, we generally hear it's a way of investing in developing innovative models, techniques and tools to put into production. Also, you have a hub of people that are real experts that can help to foster an internal culture of innovation or a knowledge hub. But then there's the question, okay, I understand the value of applied research, but why focus on pure research? And I think there are arguments around that sort of, okay, will it help us react more swiftly to new and emerging technologies? Will it help me keep my finger on the pulse of which vendors are potentially most cutting edge that we might want to work with? And then the third question is, why publish research? And I think there's a lot of arguments for this. Publishing papers, participating in academic conferences helps attract the best talent, also retain talent, and sort of generally bolster brand positioning. But I'll hand over to Alexandra and maybe we can get some other perspectives.
Thank you, Annabelle, for taking us through the results. I'd really love to invite Angelique and Jeremy and throw the question to you really about and we sort of see all of this acceleration for some banks in focusing on AI research. But I'd love to hear from you what you see the value of AI research is for banks from sort of your background and experience. And maybe Angelique, I could go to you first on this question of the value of research.
Sure. Thank you. Also great to be here today. I think really appreciate the richness of information in this report. I think it's really eye-opening to see it all in one place. So to start off, as I look at this page, I see something that's not on it, which I think it demonstrates sort of a focus and a commitment to AI by senior leadership and sort of a belief in growing AI resources. And I feel like that's a very important signal to be sending through the company. So I think that's an additional kind of add-on that I'd put in here. I think it's a time of massive transformation. And I think companies need to behave differently to position themselves for the future and really thrive. And I think we don't know what the model for winners looks like yet, right? And AI takes a long time. So we have to place some bets now. And, as I think about this question, I sort of think about what does differentiation look like and what is the role of research in that differentiation? And I'd say, I look at the first phase of banks differentiating based on subject matter expertise. And I would say a lot of businesses are still differentiated in that way. And I think the next phase is really getting that expertise embedded in the models and the caliber of the models, and even more importantly, how those models are used across the company is what is the real differentiator. And that takes, culture change and system change rather than cutting edge research. I think, where research really starts to shine is then what? What's that next phase? And, is that the place where real kind of innovation and research is needed to differentiate? And does it come from the banks? Do banks start to look like pharmaceutical companies with huge R&D arms? And I think, maybe not. Hard to see at this moment. So I think, if you have the resources, sure, build a research team and kind of hedge. I think if you don't, it really depends on your sort of mental model of the future and what challenges you're solving for now.
Thanks, Angelique. Jeremy, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. And yeah, echoing Angelique, it's great to be here. And it's super interesting to discuss this topic. I mean, I think, unfortunately, in the real world, as we all know, at the end of the day, everything comes down to what value is being created and who perceives that value. I think the point about attracting talent is very clear. The point about being innovative is very clear. One of the things I think is interesting to maybe develop a bit Angelique's thoughts is some of the research. One interesting question is whether the research is ahead of or after actually building client solutions, customer solutions. And I think there are some very interesting examples of people having discovered a model ensemble that's great for personalization, for example, which is highly innovative, and then from deploying that in action, then codifying it and publishing research around it is kind of an interesting kind of reverse on just pure research for the sake of it. So I think the point about being seen to innovate, attracting people who are interested in innovating, all of those things are really important. But I think we do always have to draw a line to value, and I think that's, I'm sure, what happens. And the last thing I'd say in that context, it's also very, very important to think about context. Not everybody has got hundreds of PhDs, who are, not daily focused on actually building stuff or doing customer solutions. But I think I totally agree with Angelique. The key thing here is the culture around it and the talent. And for that reason, I think research always does play a role, but it might be different in different contexts.
Thank you, Jeremy, and Angelique, that's really thought. I just wondered if, Tim, if you're there, if you wanted to, having also been really close to this data, have you had some reflections on it you wanted to come in with now?
I think I just building on Jeremy's point, we've very soon looking at this comparing with patents is actually what's the timing on whether people are doing research or whether they're doing patents, and actually what's, if you like, the value chain in terms of those considerations. And that's something we're going to keep looking at very closely, I think.
Great, thank you so much. And again, I'm just want to encourage people who are on this call, if they've got questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll bring those questions in. But and then I think we sort of go into the reason we've chunked it up like this is because there is so much data that we've surfaced. And again, this is just the key findings, right? There's obviously a lot more in the report, but we go from research, and then I'm going to hand over to Annabelle now again on, but to take us through the patent data. But thank you, Angelique and Jeremy, for your comments. I think it's this one of the things that we've seen, obviously, through a lot of the conversations we've had with the banks and the sort of focus on research is that point, Angelique, you said around sort of are you mimicking? Is it sort of you setting up an R&D center in your organization to mimic the structure that big tech has or other companies that have, where R&D is really important, and what kind of impact, of course, will that have on the banks themselves, and it's obviously very case by case. But with no further ado, I'm going to hand back to you, Annabelle, to take us through the patent data.
Yeah, great. If we so if we go to the next step, I guess why are we looking at patents? And I guess this slide might speak for itself. We're looking at them because there's a lot of activity going on in the AI patenting space, and I think that there are lots of question marks about why do patents matter? I think, are they a marker of innovation? Are they what are they for? But I think that generally speaking, they're there to protect IP, and a lot of banks are pursuing this in quite a defensive way. So when we look at patents, we see that there's been significant growth since 2017, really. I think 40% compound annual growth rate, largely driven by the US and the Canadian banks. Pretty much nearly, I think 99% of all the patents have been filed by US and Canadian banks, much less activity in Europe. And if we go to the next slide, just to see sort of who's leading the way, it's really looking at these North American 6 players. Bank of America was traditionally sort of very much dominant in the AI patenting space, but CapitalOne has really sharply increased their focus in this area. And when you look at what they've been doing, they talk about this one patent program where they actively encourage people all over the bank to submit ideas for patents that could be filed. And it's just an interesting approach to see them doubling down in this way, but also looking at JP Morgan, TD, Wells Fargo and RBC also focusing in this space. If we keep going, so this one, we wanted to look at, okay, is it just that European banks don't patent at all? And the answer is partially true, but that's not the only thing going on here. So what proportion of patents are AI related? When you look at a bank like RBC, one of the banks that has been doubling down, more than 60% of all of their patents between 2010 and 2021 were AI related. Similar CapitalOne high levels across these North American players. In Europe, Banco Bilbao, BBVA, is the leading bank. I think about 15% of their patents are AI related, but generally the European banks have a much lower proportion of patents in the AI space. So I think it's not just a reflection of European banks patenting less, but also a less focused on AI. And it's also interesting to note RBC, a high proportion of patents AI related, and the quality of their patents, when you look at the last couple of years, has also been very high, something we dig deeper into in the report. If you go to the next slide, Jenny. So this is just looking at the focus areas. Lots more analysis to do, I think, on this going forwards, but we see trading come shining through as the most, the greatest proportion of patents focused there, about 15% of patents focused on trading. Then we have payment space, but also user experience, so things to do with user interfaces, chatbots, financial advice, handwriting. We also look at patents related to compliance and GDPR, databases. So I think that the patent strategy might reflect, some of the focus areas that the banks are thinking about. Alexandra, should I hand back to you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, it's so interesting to see, right? Because again, this, some banks have pursued a patent strategy and being very active in patent space as a sort of a way to demonstrate innovation, right? And that may be shifting now. You see some actually pulling a bit back from a patent strategy and some doubling down. And I'm just wondering and also it's really interesting to see that there's so, far fewer patents being filed in Europe, and would love to, if anyone sort of on this call today would like to comment on that, please do put it in the chat. But Jeremy, if I could hand to you and get your reflections on these results and whether they're a surprise to you when you see sort of who's doubling down and who's not active at all.
Not really, Alexandra. I mean, I think this is an interesting area, but we do need to remember we're in the very, I mean, the weird thing about AI at the moment is it kind of feels like a new thing, but for anyone who's in it knows that it's not a new thing, right? I mean, this has been going on for decades, and there's a lot of research happened, a lot of patents being filed outside the space. My own view, I mean, being very honest, I'm not sure that a bank would tell you that they actually can see what the path to value or the real reason for filing patents is. I mean, I think it's, to a certain extent, we come back to, it's exciting for, sometimes we've hired people from academia and it's nice that they feel involved. It might be offensive, it might be defensive, but ultimately, you know, I think the proof it'll take a few years. If we see a new business being spun out of a bank based on a patent that they filed, I think that's when you'll see something, you know, interesting if that happens. I personally, and I'd be interested in others' views on this, but I doubt very much that we're going to see a situation where, because Bank X has filed a patent, then other banks will be unable to move into that space in a meaningful way. So I think it's a great sign of innovation. It's very motivating for people, but I'm not sure yet that we know really how valuable it will prove to be in the long run. Angelique, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, sort of similarly, as I think about innovation, you know, I think about, are you creating? Are your creations driving value? And I think we sort of share that real focus on value, Jeremy. And then, are your creations influencing others? And, you know, the patents are, I would say, kind of a partial signal of, are you creating? Because I think we know there are a lot of reasons whether you patent or don't patent, kind of regardless of whether you're creating. I think the big question is, you know, if you are they creating value? Are you able to differentiate your products and drive significant change to your business linked to the patents that you're building? And, you know, we don't know that yet. So I would say, I don't know if, you know, I'm worried about European banks being behind based on this data. That said, there's certainly a signaling effect again here. And that might be the more important point here is how is this being interpreted in the market? And the other question I have, which is actually just for the group, is, you know, is this an AI banking thing, or is this just sort of a general Europe, US thing in terms of sort of the scale and density of patents?
I think the only other thing to add maybe is just that there's kind of an interesting, maybe subtle cultural point in the background here, right? I mean, there's, you know, a lot of technologists like to be sharing their innovation. We're going to discuss open source a bit later. And I don't know, again, I would be interested in input from others maybe on the call, but arguably focusing on patents can be seen as quite defensive and it's also slows things down a bit potentially. And not everybody has all the resources to be spending money on lawyers and people checking things here and there. So I think it's early days. It's going to be very interesting to see how it develops. Can't deny it's a sign of innovation. There's definitely a lot of original thinking going on, but where the value is, I think time will tell.
Yeah, it's tempting to ask you what you predict, where you predict patents will be in about 5 or 6 years' time, but maybe we'll get to
the last thing I would say is I think there's a slight risk in the space of a kind of cultural shift happening to kind of very much an individual contributor type of mindset, which, you know, can be appropriate in some contexts, but in others is not. So again, I come back to the point about context. It's a really interesting theme, but I think it's a while till we see how value will develop. And I think it will be different in different markets and with different players.
Thanks. And I Tim, you've got your hand up. So if we could just
Sure, I think we just shouldn't underestimate about how much this looks like a place where banks are taking very clearly different strategic choices than other banks. So Bank of America alone has got 50 times the number of patents of all the European banks put together. So there's a huge, massive shift here in terms of concentration of work going on in North America. Now, clearly, there's a very big difference in terms of how the patent offices work. And it's not just in AI, it's across the entire space where things could be patented in North America, particularly the US, which just wouldn't be considered in the UK or Europe. So there's a big cultural difference going on here. But we can see that people like CapitalOne with their one patent program, the fact that, for example, they've managed to bring the time to get a patent through to 645 days compared with, say, 1,500 for Barclays in the UK. You can see they're running a very clear and very consistent strategic approach here. If you look at where the patents are coming through, trading is the #1 place for patents at the moment. That's largely because of RBC who's doing it. But it's very interesting that, for example, you don't see the big Wall Street powerhouses also putting patents into the trading space, even though potentially they've got a lot of intellectual property in that space. So we're seeing very clear different strategies emerging. And as Jeremy says, they're based on a bunch of different views. One is around protection against potential patent trolls, potential other players out there. There's talk, for example, of various banks coming together in patent alliances to make sure that they can find ways through this particular mix. But also these are banks who are saying, you know, we still have an opportunity now to basically shape the direction of where we're going. Do we want to actually own some of the guardrails and some of the platforms which we're sat on? And I think to Jeremy's point, it's not yet clear whether this will play through, but some banks are taking a very clear strategic approach here, and it'd be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, no, for sure. I can see that. I don't know if we want to bring Ankit, if you want to come in and sort of raise the point that you raised in the chat. Just put a note in the chat if we can bring you in, but otherwise I'm just going to read what you wrote here. So one of the reasons I feel banks are filing patents is to counter the growing tech companies entering their space. It's like showing some bravado, but not sure if that's useful, since Google and Amazon of the world are quite successful with their financial products. I don't know, Angelique, if you've got a comment on that comment. It'd be interesting to hear your view.
Yeah, I mean, I love the bravado. Am I unmuted? Yeah, I love the bravado point. And, you know, I think this is sort of what Jeremy and I were both saying, is there's clearly signaling value from patents right now, and we don't know the actual line to driving business value and sort of protecting the actual IP of the companies going forward. So I think it's a bit too early to tell.
The only thing I would add is, I mean, I think that is a great point. I think as we think about this space generally, I think feet on the ground is quite important. I mean, my personal view, and I'm quite biased here, I think there's a lot, you know, I think the chance of anyone, you know, however big a bank you are, do you really want to be competing with all the thousands and thousands of people and all the big tech players? Whereas, you know, in your own space, you know, things like feature engineering and the interface with your own data stack and stuff like that, I think is going to be incredibly valuable as well. So I think there's an interesting question about how you balance. I mean, we're not talking about that here, we're talking about one side of it, but the chance for it to innovate in competition, I like the bravado point, but in the long run, that seems to me to be potentially a bit of a white elephant, but that's a personal view.
I just wanted to point, before we go on to the next section, Peter Scott has also a really interesting point here, and I don't know if we wanted to bring, if Peter can come in and ask it himself, otherwise I'm just going to read it here. In some sectors, patents are filed not so much for development, but for licensing and trading. And we've also seen that in our data. Are these banks more likely to develop their patents or monetize them? And I don't know if you've got, I don't know, maybe back to you on that, Tim, because I know that you took quite a close look at that data.
I don't think we yet know the answer to that. And we did wonder how much they were trading patents, or how much they, for example, use them as part of sort of other things around some of their venture companies. At this stage, they all seem very much to be their own internal patents, as opposed to ones they bought in from elsewhere. So we're not quite clear where that's going. But I think clearly CapitalOne is spending a lot of money in the space. So it'd be interesting to know what their strategy is when they get there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a point that Miko is making in the chat also on. But that these are points that you've all made also, but just echoing that, I think is interesting phenomena. It seems patents is a way to keep the PhD hires happy and allowing them to share their work. I mean, and I think that we see that again and again, not only in the patent side, but also in the research side, and the ability to publish research, but also participate in open source platforms and so on. There's a lot of the AI talent that really likes to see those markers in the banks, that the banks are allowing them to do that, to participate and sort of contribute back into the community. But we're going to go through that in a minute. But Annabelle, I guess over to you. I don't know if there's anything else in the chat that you've spotted that you wanted to comment on from your side, Annabelle?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is I think that from our initial analysis, it looks like the actual people filing the patents, like the inventors, are actually quite different from the researchers. Something we're going to look into more in due course. But yeah, really enjoying the chat. So good questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Should we go to the next section then? Right.
Yeah, so I guess the last section is really sort of looking at how banks are engaging with all sorts of different ecosystems and partnerships. Jenny, if you go to the next slide. So again, I think it's pretty much impossible to really define this in any kind of very concrete way, how banks are engaging with different types of partnerships and ecosystems when it comes to AI, but we've attempted to do it and would welcome feedback. But I think broadly we look at 5 areas. So the first area is really partnerships with universities and research institutions. There are many banks that we speak to that totally appreciate the value of research, but they're not necessarily building their own in-house teams. And they have a lot of different partnerships, partnerships like MIT or Harvard or different universities all over the world, hiring partnerships. Some of them are very focused on hiring. Some of them are focused on teaching. Some of them are more around accelerator partnerships, so investing in ideas to spin out from those universities. The second area we really look at is engagement with the open source community. I think that every bank we speak to really is looking at all of the sort of open source tools and systems that are available, but there are some banks that more actively participate than others. We'll come on to that in a second. The third one is really the sort of tech and the data startups. So partnering with different vendors or investing in those companies, fintech companies, regtech companies, all sorts of data providers. We'll come on to that more in a minute as well. Then you've got the kind of partnerships with big tech players, the traditional cloud providers, but also a lot of other AI specialist consultancies. I think there's a bit of a blurring line between where a cloud provider relationship ends and where almost a consultancy relationship begins. And we can maybe, Jeremy can reflect on that in a minute. And then a whole host of other relationships as well. So industry, consortia and alliances, relationships with government agencies and policymakers, we see that a lot, and not-for-profits as well. But if we just dive onto the next slide, I think we're looking at the open source ecosystem. And I think, like I said, there's the difference, I guess, between sort of using tools from the open source ecosystem and then contributing back into the open source ecosystem. And I think the former, using tools from open source, I think is pretty much something that's every bank is doing. But contributing to the ecosystem, I think is a bit more of a varied strategy. And when we look at GitHub, for example, just looking at the AI related repositories, you can see that, again, like CapitalOne is doing this slightly more than other banks, but JP Morgan's in there. But there are also a lot of European players. So BBVA, again, ING, but SocGen and others that are, at least participating in some way. And I think that there's an interesting point here, which is some banks say to us, if you find anything related to our bank on GitHub, please let us know and we'll take it down. So I think there's sort of, very different strategies emerging. And maybe at the end of this section, we can just talk that through a bit more. If we keep going to the next slide, though, we sort of dive more into the investment strategies of companies, of the banks. So obviously, it's very difficult to assess from the outside which banks partner with which vendor. Would love to do that. So if anyone has ideas, let us know. But this is really looking at the investments into AI startups. And you can see generally there's been an increasing focus, I think about a 15% CAGR from 2017 to 2022. Historically, the North American banks dominated. So back in 2015, about 90% of the investment deals, the number of deals into AI companies were from North American banks, but this fell to about 60% in 2022, with the European banks investing in sort of building ventures teams and investing more. So definitely something to monitor for 2023 and beyond. If we keep going to the next slide, again, don't want to be like a broken record, but the top 5 investors in AI companies are from the US. Wells Fargo leads the way, although there is an interesting sort of debate here in our team. What counts as an AI, what counts as an investment and what investments should we count? So a lot of Wells Fargo's investments are made via Norwest Venture Partners, which is one of their partners. And so if what we're trying to do here is assess the AI maturity of banks, we're trying to assess the investments that tend to be more strategic or may end up being used in the bank. And when we look at it sort of anecdotally, Tim and I trawling through all of the investments, you can see, about 70% we think could end up being used or related to the bank's activities. There are a whole load of other investments that are into AI companies that may or may not be related to financial services or of any kind of actual immediate value to the bank. They might be more returns focused. The final thing I'd say is there are some European banks that are in the top 10. So BNP, Credit Mutual, Barclays. There are lots of other, banks with ventures teams like HSBC as well. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how the European banks, what they do in the coming years. Next slide. I think this is just the final slide that's on data anyway. It's just looking at where the investments go into. So looking at the targets of the investments. And I think when you look at about 60% of them, I think have been based in the States, but there are also a lot of investments all over the world. But what's interesting is when you look at sort of investments targets in France, most of the investments in France into French startups have been made by the French banks. Whereas in the UK, for example, a lot of the investments into UK startups have been made by American banks. And in fact, the UK banks themselves are more likely to invest in startups in the States than in the UK. And I think building on, Colin's point in the chat about, maybe there is a lot of activity happening in Europe, but it's activity that's sort of owned or talent that is employed by non-European based banks. I think that's something that we see sort of repeatedly in a lot of our analysis. Next slide. I think that's over to you, Alexandra.
Yeah. I think before I address this slide, there's a lot of strategic questions to unpack in what you've just run through there, Annabelle, and I'll just get to this slide. But I think in terms of just sort of the role of open source ecosystems, this question around build versus buy, and I don't know if the question around the increase in investing strategically in AI companies, gets to the heart of that question of build versus buy explicitly, but it certainly touches on where the balance may be shifting in terms of, are you building it, or are you trying to get AI implementation accelerators from outside? And I'd love to sort of dive into that. And actually, I think, Jeremy, if you also, because we spoke previously about sort of your views on the role of open source ecosystems. So I'd love to get to that. And here, just on the last slide, I mean, this is not, it's not really us saying this is what, banks should do, but it's more a reflection of what we're seeing banks doing. And sort of going to sort of how we opened, which was, there's no doubt that would be, it's a good thing to have an AI strategy, but then how on innovation, an AI innovation strategy in the bank, but then how that's composed is obviously very sort of dependent on what type of bank you are, where you are, and also where you are in terms of your maturity. But definitely some of the things that we're seeing is that, an AI innovation strategy is established. An AI research team in some banks is built. AI research is published. There is a link to universities and partnerships outside of the bank that are academic or otherwise sort of accelerators of AI implementation. And then some banks build an AI patent strategy that we just talked about. So those are just the sort of the ingredients of what people are and banks are looking at right now. And probably, and this is a long way to throw it to you, Jeremy, but could you talk us through your views on sort of the mix of that? And if you look out 5 to 6 years from now, what will the successful banks have done, which would be question one? And also, just because we're in this, a change in this sort of way AI gets talked about within the banks, and sort of how it's really sort of pushed up into the boardrooms and the C-suite now because of the release of ChatGPT. So in your view, sort of what has happened and what has changed in the last 6 months?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, look, everyone on this call will have views on this. I mean, I think I already said earlier that it's kind of almost amusing how, the contrast between the many years of discussion about AI, which was really hard for people to find traction. I mean, Angelique might have views about this, but I've heard many people who played the chief analytics officer, the chief data officer role in banks have a lot of frustration over the last few years in trying to get the whole organization to focus on this. But in the last few months, that's suddenly changed. And now, it's on board calls and nobody can ignore it. And while a lot of that is because of the focus on large language models, there's no doubt that people, are kind of aware strategically in ways they weren't before. And what does that mean in practice? I think that, where all of this stuff is going is that while it is still early days and there are no kind of easy answers to any of this, it is very interesting to observe what different people are doing. But the biggest thing for me is that you can no longer let kind of isolated, islands of experimentation develop across the bank and across the organization, because the pace of change is too fast. And the benefits now of making sure that we learn from all these experiments and we can apply across the whole value chain, what we learn, and we can develop our own best practice, and we can build our own tools, and we can figure out who the best partners are. So for me, what all of this is about it's about balancing this kind of top-down view for the first time of value, the perception of value, and where it's going to come from, and recognizing that there are opportunities right across the value chain, from KYC documentation automation through to trading decisions, through to personalization, through to risk and fraud. All of these are very different use cases, but they're all valuable in different ways across the bank. So how do we kind of make sure that we're matching our innovation against those opportunities? And how do we capture learning across the organization and make sure we're all learning together? And everything we're seeing on this page are ways of learning. They're ways of learning and ways of seeing progress happen. But for me, the internal job of kind of balancing that top-down direction and push and resource allocation, and the bottom-up innovation, which is necessary to make sure we get the subject matter experts and the right culture in the organization coming together. I think that's, for me, the big picture that we're trying to kind of discern through the fog here. And all of these different indicators take us in that direction. So it's a bit inward, it's a bit outward, but it is more coherent. It's making sure that we learn lessons once and we don't have to relearn them expensively again, that we're building strategically, in a modular way. All those kind of good things have to be more strategically established, including relationships, including investment, including talent. And then bottom up, we're saying, we want to see where the value is as well, and we want to see the innovation come from different parts of the value chain, wherever people see it. That would be my summary, Alexandra. But Angelique, I don't know how much of that chimes in with your view, or whether that makes sense to you. And then maybe if others on the call might have their own views, very happy to be challenged.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great list of 10, and you've done such a nice job laying out kind of all these areas of consideration and the potential landscape and the pros and cons, and really feel like we have a blueprint to think about innovation. I think sort of staring at it and seeing it all laid out, it really is striking how big and sort of far-reaching the effort is. And so for me, really highlights the importance of number one, of having a clear strategy on how to invest and why. And I think I was smiling when Jeremy was mentioning, I think people in AI leadership roles used to spend most of the time sort of storytelling and pitching AI. And now it's really about getting it done. And, we've spent a lot of time doing sort of bottom up proof points. And now we have the space, the time, and frankly, the demand to build a top down strategic view. I think I'll always encourage people to start with why. What's the goal? What's the impact? What matters? What are you trying to achieve? And it sounds very obvious, but repeatedly see people sort of taking something like this list and sort of going after different pieces of it without seeing how it fits together. And I think one thing in this space in particular, as I stare at the list of 10, in my experience, there's very different teams driving each of those. And so really spending the time to sort of stitch that all together and take a holistic view that goes across those teams, I think is really critical. I'm going to throw one thing that I don't see on the list in here as well, which is something I'm particularly passionate about, which is, ensuring that there's real product and business system innovation and sort of the identification of transformational use cases. So I think sort of based on the current state of where we are with AI, there's just enormous value in actually applying it broadly across the banks. And that is really a game of, system change and culture change, which I fear is a lot harder than technical change. So I want to kind of put in a plug for that as well.
I really agree with that. And on that point, I mean, I'm looking at your list of 10 here, and I fully agree that you need to see the whole landscape, and there will be slightly different weightings for different people and even different interpretations. But I think the big point that I would if this is what you're saying, I agree with it, Angelique, is that the innovation has got to be something that everybody owns. It doesn't just sit in your AI team, right? And I think that's so creating collaboration between subject matter experts, workflow owners, process owners, client management teams, creating the right interfaces between those groups and your, whatever you want to call your AI teams. I think that's a big unlock when it comes to what we're all looking for here, which is, as Angelique and I've said many times now, which is the elusive question of where is the value, which I think we need to keep asking ourselves.
There's a question of, Jeremy, you talk about the culture and like the ideation and the identification of the opportunity has to sort of be infused within the business lines and sit across the bank. And I'm just wondering what you think is, how do you, what are the components that support that kind of culture?
Well, I think it's, I mean, as has already been said, I mean, number one is number one for a reason, right? I mean, leadership saying we take this seriously, and having a clear North Star for the organization is absolutely number one. And then obviously you need to put meat on those bones. You talk here about a roadmap. Roadmaps are like heaven and hell. We all need one, but we all hate them, right? But you've got to have some kind of way of getting there. And then I think then there's a lot of detail behind that. And if some of it's on this page, it'll be different for everybody. But it is a very much, I think, ultimately a leadership point here that, this is important for us. It's strategic. There's a role for everybody to play here. We want to make sure that we learn as an organization, and we're looking and we're curious, and we're looking in the data all the time and applying new techniques and models against it. So for me, it's not one, there's no one easy answer, but it's pretty clear that without number one, you don't, I think, get very far. You need all the other bits in different proportions. But I mean, speaking candidly, if I'm always, I think a conversation with a CEO is always a good thing to have to find out whether an organization is serious.
Yeah. And maybe, and also would love to throw this to you, Tim, but just maybe quickly back to Angelique on sort of what do you think are the components that that help that nimbleness in terms of, as you say, sort of the thing that you saw missing in and how do you get the, what are the components that drive that? What should banks be doing to support?
Alexandra, can I just, before you answer, can I just pick up on that question from John in the chat? Because I think it does play into that question, actually, because I think, and again, it is a really, really interesting question, because we are looking here across a bunch of different, very different animals, right? And different sectors. And, the trading floor is a very, very different place to the compliance department. So does the data exist to show the relative maturity of innovation across different sectors, not just banking? I would say within the bank, you need to look right across the value chain. In this case, though, I think, Alexandra, you're not looking at other sectors, but I would encourage everybody to look right across the value chain within the banks. Sorry.
I would just put a bit of a flag up there saying that we are going to cover other sectors in the future. And we're very curious about that question ourselves in terms of what are the common themes that we're going to be able to draw across the sectors and not just for banks. But over to you, Angelique, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to sort of emphasize Jeremy's points around having a North Star and being leadership led. I think there's a couple other things that come to mind for me as well, which is the operating model. And I think, a lot of banks are set up in kind of functional silos versus sort of networks of distributed teams. And I think the more and more we need to bring sort of machine and human together and work across multiple different functions to really drive the kind of change we're talking about, the more we need to sort of think about that differently. And I think it's particularly important with a research team that kind of often sits in a central position farther away from the business. And, the closer the AI work is to the business and the subject matter expertise, the more opportunity there is for success. And I think the other piece here is culture shift. We really are starting to shift from a world where banks are driven by, human subject matter expertise to human and machine. And, the rubber hits the road when you're actually looking at how the decisions are being made. And are you willing to start to trust the machine and to sort of, manage the machines through having some transparency and some control, but not ultimately being the ones driving the decision making. And I think that cultural shift is sort of where we're at now, because I think the caliber of the AI systems is there, but that shift is a very hard one to make. So.
But I really, I think it's a fantastic point, and I see, I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, is it Miku? I think that hits your point, Angelique, his comment in there. And I do think that, again, this comes back to leadership, right? I mean, is there, I was talking to someone earlier today in a telco, and the question there was, how can I talk to everybody about AI? Because as soon as we start talking about it, because of what's in the news, everyone's terrified because it means people losing their jobs and stuff like that. So I think having a vision of why and purpose, to that level of what it means for job satisfaction, what it means for, there is some automation, but it also enables some creativity. But having a clear view on that and being able to talk about that is a significant leadership challenge, which is only going to grow, I think. And it is very necessary to underpin exactly that shift you've been talking about, Angelique, now, where we can't, we just cannot ignore the opportunity to do a better job for our customers and our stakeholders by teaming up with machines compared with a few years ago. But that doesn't always mean automation, and being clear about those things is really important.
Tim, can I bring you in to comment on this question around where you see what do the banks need to be doing now in order to be sort of ahead of the game or stay in the game 5 to 6 years from now?
I mean, one thing that's really striking, particularly about the talent report, is actually how concentrated the successful banks are in this particular innovation chapter. So you look at the list of names, it's the same 7 or 8 banks that come up time and time again. And what we're seeing therefore is 7 or 8 banks have basically decided to make a big strategic focus on investing in the IP and basically trying to work out what the future looks like, however dark it may be looking forward. And I think that's partly because AI historically has been very hard to do. And it requires very smart people like Jeremy and Angelique to come together with large amounts of capital resources to make it work. And as we enter the generative AI space and sort of the new post-ChatGPT world, AI suddenly feels very easy. It isn't necessarily easy to actually do it properly, but it feels very easy to get out there and start getting involved in doing it. And your marketing team can start doing stuff, and your HR team can start doing stuff. And there can be a real sense of almost bottom-up innovation coming through that is something we've not seen in the first wave of AI, which is very much top-down, chief executive or senior management-led approach. And so I think there's a really big opportunity here for actually banks to start working out how they can start using some of that bottom-up innovation and using that to overcome some of those cultural challenges and the sort of the HR resistance that Jeremy was talking about in terms of people being worried about AI and what it might do. And that's a really big opportunity that it'd be interesting to see in the next couple of years, whether we see a reset in these figures. Do we go from 7 banks who are really good at the old model to actually an opportunity for banks to come through with a new model and actually evolve and change and challenge that setup leadership at the top? Particularly in Europe, I think there's a real opportunity for a bank to come through and become the European AI bank, to really position that clearly there. So I think there's lots of opportunity, and just interesting to see whether generative AI enables that reset opportunity for people.
Hey, Kevin, great to see you. I know you were on.
Kevin's on here. Kevin, do you want to come in and ask your great question you've put in the chat? I think Sam is pulling you in as we speak. There we go. Hi, Kevin. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say I love the fact base you bring to bear in topics like innovation. Really, really wonderful to see. My question was, what organizational models have you seen as most effective at banks that are pursuing this aggressively? So different banks have different models for how to organize data, analytics, AI in particular. And I'm just curious as to what the range of organizational models you've seen and which you've seen have worked effectively or less effectively.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's really that's on the data side, right, Kevin?
Well, I would say data and analytics and AI. So some have taken a very central model, some have taken a very federated model, close to the businesses, and I'm curious as to other approaches that have worked.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Shall I take that briefly, and then maybe?
Yeah, but I would. Yeah, and then I'll follow on from you, because I can address that from what we've seen from a sort of.
Why don't you go with what the data shows first, and then I'll say.
But
my opinions.
It's really interesting. I mean, it really when the index was released, and when you look at the index in its entirety, right, not just the innovation side, but it was with the talent as well, and sort of they're very closely linked. But what we see in terms of the organizational structure is that the leading banks, and as you know, they're dominated by the North American banks, and they have the common approach, which has been that the ones that are leading have made a decision 5, 6, 7 years ago to be more sort of build like a tech company rather than a better bank, and therefore organize themselves around having that R&D center and hiring very aggressively for AI talent and being very centralized, right, and not decentralized. So they focused on a centralized system, focused on having that research pure, not only always pure, but publishing research and to some extent patents, and having that in a centralized in the bank, right? And so you can see that both in the organizational structure, you can see that in sort of the markers and the activity on the things that we've been talking about here, but you can also see that coming through in the strategy around hiring. So that talent strategy is also being sort of, getting a very large, a high proportion of AI talent in the bank, and sort of where they sit would also point to being quite centralized system, but it definitely a mix of the two, right? It's got to be as both, everyone's commented on here, a bottom up and a top down, but you definitely see that there's a presence of centralization. So that's sort of what we see from the data. I don't know, Annabelle, if you wanted to jump in and comment on that, but otherwise, Jeremy, do jump in on that. I know you wanted to say something before.
No, Annabelle, you go first if you have anything, because your data is what we're here to listen to, not my opinions.
Well, I was going to say, I think we'll have a more concrete view of this when we publish the leadership report. But I guess to Alexandra's point, centralized versus decentralized, but also what do those teams do? Like, what's the remit of those centralized teams if they are centralized? And also, who do they report into? Are they in the tech teams or are they in the innovation teams? And how do you join that up? And also, how, if you're going to build a centralized AI center of excellence, how does that fit alongside your existing data or your analytics capabilities? And do you carve it out as a distinct unit or not? That's a lot of questions that I haven't got answers on.
Yeah. I mean, Kevin, you will have a lot of experience yourself of this, but I don't know if you would agree with me, but I think I would say two things. Firstly, it really helps to make sure that you can centralize your learnings wherever they occur in the organization. Point number one. So ideally, you don't want to have a random team of data scientists doing something somewhere and not for the rest of the organization to benefit from it, if possible. So that argues for some form of centralization when it comes to tooling choices, as well as risk and a bunch of other things. But against that, it is absolutely critical that the business is fully aligned and involved, because otherwise you don't have a proper value discussion. So for me, I like to see the CDO, some representative of the CIO or the CDO sitting next to the divisional business unit leads and really building a joint strategy together. That would be my answer to your question. I don't know whether the data shows that, but that, and Kevin, you probably have your own views, but that's how I see it.
That resonates quite a bit. So I think a lot of organizations are in flux, and we've seen changes at some organizations, even recently. So I'm very curious as to how this evolves.
So I'm going to hand over to Rohit in 1 second, but I just wanted to sort of, one thing is that where we see the data moving and banks are sort of showing more and more visibility on centralization as a strategy, but also anecdotally, the banks that have been very decentralized in their approach have questioned that, and not naming any names, but just sort of have questioned whether the decentralization approach and everything being determined in the lines of business is the way to go. Because when you've got to decide on the prioritization of, which you say, and it's only been intensified with generative AI, but as looking at every use case across all business lines and looking at the dollar value assigned to it, and trying to figure out how to prioritize, having a centralized system to do that and to really understand the value that's being driven by AI, I think has become very clear that it's really important. But we've got only a few more minutes, sadly, but I want to just hand over to Rohit, because you had some really good points in the chat, and handing over to you.
Yeah, hi. I just have a question with respect to regulatory frameworks. As you can expect when you're talking about the banks, discussions are never complete when you actually complete the dots with respect to regulatory frameworks and how they operate. So I just wanted to see, it would be interesting to see if there are any research done on the regulatory side of things, on what they are doing to make sure that the banks are compliant or what they're doing. There's no breaches, etc. So it makes it easier for a bank to do on the side of the business doing things. But the moment you start bringing into the mainstream applications, mainstream architecture, these things start coming in. So just curious to see if there are being done, or are there any changes within G20 countries if certain regulatory frameworks are more maturing versus the others?
Thank you, Rohit. That's a really excellent question, and I think extremely relevant today, right now, as a regulation is changing, and we know that obviously banks are participating in the conversations around what the future regulation would look like and what that means for the banks, and what kind of requirements that will arise from that in terms of what needs to be submitted, and along the lines of, as we all know, the fairness and bias and explainability, and how does that change, especially with large language models and so on, and what does the AI Act in the EU, mean for what banks and versus what's going on in the US and so on. And we look at sort of the engagement from our perspective in the index. We look at that, but I don't know if Angelique, if you or Jeremy or Tim sort of have specific sort of examples of what's going on, of the sort of the discussion between the regulators and the banks. I don't know, Tim, is that something I can't see? Jeremy, is that something that you're following closely?
I mean, yeah, but it's a great question. But as Rohit, as you well know, I mean, it's moving very, very fast, right? And I think it's accelerated in the last few months. There tends to be quite good levels of contact anyway. I think there's a very interesting cultural norms differences as well. We have this kind of interesting challenge as to whether or not, we're obviously, I think global, a global regulatory view is a bit of a pie in the sky. I don't think that's very realistic at the moment. But I think that I think Europe and I think in the US culturally, you can move faster than we can here. So for me, it's all of those things. And I don't see, the short answer to your question is, I don't know, but it's very live and it will continue to be very live. Angelique, you may have a more up-to-date, more specific view.
No, I mean, I think the speed of change that we're seeing at the moment is, I agree with you. I don't have anything to add.
Tim, did you want to come in? Yeah.
Is where a lot of the use cases the banks have can be caught up with the EU AI Act, particularly the sort of the high risk category. So you can see that being something that's quite important. But I think the other thing that's quite critical is that regulators increasingly need to staff up to make sure they've got the staff who can actually handle these sorts of questions, because that's a real challenge at the moment.
I mean, it is interesting, just for one small example, and I'm sure you know this, Rohit, that in the EU, a customer will have the right to ask whether they're having a conversation with a human or will an algorithm, for example. So it's not just providing that service, it's also being able to back up the service with the ability to answer those questions in ways which, are scalable. So I think that is very much a big part of people's thinking right now.
Yeah, I agree. We've gone over time. It just goes to show that thank you for all the interest and the great questions. So we could have continued on, but we're 2 minutes over and I don't want to take any more of your time, but really thank everyone for joining, and really thank you to Jeremy, to Angelique, to Tim, for helping us along here with the report and sort of really thinking through and chewing through all of the big questions that get thrown up by all of this data, everything that's measurable and not measurable. And thank you, Kevin, for participating in your great question, and Rohit and everyone in the chat, Peter, Colin, Miko, and so on. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. We're going to be publishing a leadership report in the next couple of months, as well as a use case mapping report in the fall, ahead of our update and expanded index launch, which is going to take place in around November 9. And as many of you know, we're going to be hosting a symposium, an AI symposium in New York, where we're going to continue the conversation that we're having here, but with the whole ecosystem, but also people on the sort of front end of AI development and geopolitics and regulation and so on. But thank you so much for joining. We will be in touch again very soon, and have a great rest of the day.